Hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to another episode of Post-Progressive Inquiries, a podcast co-production of the Institute for Cultural Evolution and the Daily Evolver podcast.
Great.
My guest today is Charles M. Johnson, MD, a psychiatrist who is often described as a cultural psychiatrist, as he is dedicated to the healthy growing up of the human species. And that kind of thing, Charles, is catnip to me and my listeners, I got to tell you. The titles are just such a bullseye. The first one is your magnum opus, which is Creative Systems Theory, a comprehensive theory of purpose, change, and interrelationship in human systems, parentheses, with particular pertinence to understanding the times we live in and the tasks ahead for the species. That's pretty good. Okay. And then the shorter book, which is sort of maybe popularized version of this and focused on a major upstream issue in our culture, which is polarization, is titled Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord: Why We See Such Extreme Social and Political Polarization and What We Can Do About It. And both these books are available now, right, Charles? Yeah, on Amazon and so forth. So, well, welcome. It's really good to have you with us.
Good to talk again.
Yeah. So I guess we should start with you giving us a brief intro and maybe overview of your thesis here.
Great. Well, let me just step back a little bit. I chuckle a little bit in that, we've had a trying year for everyone with the pandemic at all, and I kind of laugh at it when I look back on, and people ask me, well, what did you do during your pandemic year? It's like I basically, when the pandemic started, I said, I'm not going to be able to do 3/4 of what I usually do. What can I do? Well, I'm going to dive in for some really deep dive writing. And I have a general practice in my life that during the winter months, I set everything else aside and I write. That's allowed me to write books through the course of my life. And I was just surfacing from that in February of last year when the pandemic hit, and it was like, okay.
Full speed ahead on the deep dive.
We're just going to go right back in again. And so I had been working on the big Creative Systems Theory book, which is, it's 650 pages. It's a monster, for 3 or 4 years before that in winter times. And so that was where I first dove back in, and great to finish that book because it really is a compilation of, nearly 50 years of theoretical inquiry and 25 years of directing the Institute for Creative Development, in which we were applying creative systems principles to leadership and critical cultural issues. And this, in a sense, brings all of that together, and it's sort of part compilation. It's part memoir in terms of how ideas have developed over time and changed me over time, and that back and forth that any creative process does. And also an attempt to push the ideas of creative systems theory just as far out as I was able to do it.
Yeah.
And
right
so I feel grateful to have it done and a little relieved to have that piece.
Yeah. Well, it's quite an achievement. And it's interesting that the Venn diagram of what you do in integral theory is highly overlapped. Yeah. And you're doing this on your own. You've been doing this, and with your Institute for Cultural Creative Development.
Yeah.
But I hadn't heard of you, and I'm not really up on necessarily the current philosophers because I don't find them that interesting when I do.
Yeah.
And so Steve McIntosh said, this guy's really great and we should pay attention to him. And so here we are. And so what I want to ask you is just what do you bring into the party here, Charles?
Right. Well, let's start from, obviously in talking about creative systems theory, we're talking about a huge body of work and we're having a brief conversation.
Right.
But I think the starting place would be, the question that really is the foundation with creative systems theory is really, how do we best understand what most fundamentally makes us human? And, and what creative systems theory suggests is it's the audacity of our meaning-making, tool-making, for lack of a better word, creative capacities as human beings. And it examines how, when we really look deeply at the workings of human intelligence, intelligence is structured to support those capacities, okay? Now, notice what that does is there's a fundamental leap that happens with that observation. It's not a small observation in terms of the history of ideas, okay? Because, because our previous sort of fundamental organizing image in different manifestations during the modern age was that we were, it defined who we were in terms of rationality, in terms of, the universe is a great machine, to put it in Cartesian terms, and creative systems theory says, no, that was a nice piece for that slice in the history and the story of humanity, but we need deeper, more complex ways of understanding going forward that more fully grasp our complexity as human beings. One thing I've grasped is the complexity of human intelligence, because rationality is only one small part of human intelligence. And creative systems theory says that we're at an interesting transitional time in the evolution of the human narrative. We're really fundamentally needing a new kind of story. We're in a kind of transitional time, a kind of crisis of purpose. And a key concept within creative systems theory is the concept of cultural maturity, which is simply some language for talking about the kinds of perspectives we're going to need to be able to hold in order to fully understand our time and to have the capacities available to us that we need to make good choices going forward as a species. And we can understand cultural maturity in a certain way most simply as we've really related to culture and our cultural realities as kind of like a parent historically. And that's been very, very important to us. I mean, all the way from the times of God Kings, when culture was seen as divine voice, to, we've still mythologized our leaders in times past, and we've had My Country, Right and Wrong during the modern age. And I would say all of that has served us in very important ways, because it's reduced the uncertainty and complexity of life and given us a kind of sense of identity and all of that. But there's a kind of growing up our task is about, in which we're having to take a more conscious kind of responsibility in the truths that we use, okay? And that first step is often talked about in sort of postmodern terms. And I would say, well, that's part of it. But cultural maturity says, no, that's only one part of it, okay? It's also the case that any stage in the evolution of understanding, and creative systems theory maps out stages in the evolution of understanding from our tribal beginnings, those big picture, long-term stuff. Each is organized differently cognitively. So it's not like over time we've just thought different things. We've thought in different ways, okay? And so the concept with cultural maturity is that we are being challenged to think in a new kind of way, which it calls, for lack of a better term, it's a complicated term, but it's so descriptive, I use it anyway, which is integrated meta-perspective. It's like we're needing to be able to step up above intelligence as a whole, including our rationality, so we can critique our rationality, okay? And be able to hold the whole of our human complexity when we're making choices, okay? And that's what's needed, okay? And I often use as a metaphor, it's like we have to be able to hold the whole box of crayons. And you can think of that whole box of crayons in terms of just the whole of who we are, so that we're not projecting parts of ourselves. Like historically, we've needed to have a world of chosen people and evil others in some way on the global stage or in politics in order to feel a sense of identity. Okay, so part of cultural maturity and integrated meta perspective is keeping those projections at home and be able to hold the whole of who we are, but of huge importance with creative systems theory as it plays out, as it delineates different kinds of patterns and understanding, is that we're also being challenged to really understand intelligence much more complexly, all the different aspects of intelligence, not just rationality, but our body intelligence, our imaginations, our emotional intelligence, and how they all work together. So creative systems theory, for example, has a variety of different kinds of patterning concepts in it. One of them is, it just calls patterning in time, which is developmental notions. And what it maps out is that we can understand different stages in human development, in individual psychological development, in any kind of creative process, in the development of a relationship, or in the evolution of culture up to this point. Okay, in terms of a predictable sequence of kinds of cognitive organization which utilize different ones of the multiple intelligences in different ways. Okay,
Yeah.
So, and it just says, okay, that's how things play out. And we could take time and look at those parallels if you want to.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's that. But it also has patterning in space concepts that, for example, that have us understand relationships between different systems in more creative ways. So that can help us rethink leadership. It can help us think in terms of the evolution of love and what love's demanding in our time. And it also includes a very sophisticated framework for understanding personality styles, which the creative systems personality typology, which again is saying, oh boy, much more than we recognize. We haven't had the cognitive capacity to recognize it. We, by virtue of temperament, see the world in profoundly different ways, much more differently than most people realize. Yeah. And so that's another piece of it. So creative systems theory is a framework. A simple way to put it is that our times are challenging us to think in culture mature ways, to bring that kind of integrative meta perspective, that all the crayons in the box way of seeing the world, to questions of all sorts. And creative systems theory is a very sophisticated, highly delineated framework for looking at the world and looking at oneself in culturally mature terms.
Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating and very exciting. And it seems very aligned with integral theory as we presented over here in the integral scene, where, we're looking at least in the developed world, three major worldviews that are vying for, supremacy in a certain way. One being the traditional worldview, which is more God and country, and more spiritual. The world's enchanted at that stage. And there's stages before that too, tribal and warrior and so forth. But the big ones are that, the God and country, social conservatives, just its own way of thinking. And then secular modernity, and with rationality and human rights and, that sort of thing. And then the sensitivity of post-modernity, where we get into interiors and psychotherapy and multiculturalism and world centrism around culture, climate change, and that sort of thing, and really want to, in some ways, right the wrongs of history. And that integral is next, and that integral consciousness and an integral culture that would come out of that is lots of things, but one thing it is a culture where all of these previous worldviews are lit up and allowed to be expressed. And we feel them within our own psyches. Yep. And so I want to ask you, so if we think of the difference between a religious and a secular worldview is huge. The worldview between, a mechanistic, if scientistic rationality, a hard sort of rationality, and the sensitivity and multiculturalism of postmodernity is huge. So this next one's going to be huge too. What's that look like? I mean, you're a psychiatrist. You've seen the mechanisms of the mind and the culture, and how do you see it?
Yeah.
I mean, and first of all, is that assessment, or is there anything I said about the sort of an integral interpretation of what you're doing that sticks in your craw?
Not particularly. I mean, we can spend a lot of time going into nuance and detail, and there's places that people get caught in there that end up being sort of self-affirming to their own temperament that kind of miss the bigger picture and the challenge of it. But I think certainly what you said in terms of the ability to, I mean, I think your phrase was light up all those previous realities and their validity. One of the things that's that most people don't recognize that's an inherent part of any developmental process is that we have amnesias for the states that we move beyond. Okay, and it's necessary for development. I mean, it's necessary so that we don't fall back into the easy realities of where we've come from. So
Totally.
it's sort of funny to talk to adolescents about childhood, and they don't even remember it. They can't make sense of it. They think kids are just kind of stupid. But then you talk to young adults about adolescence, and it's like it's not only that it seems stupid, it really doesn't. They can't grok it. It does. It's there. There's a door that's closed. Okay. And then one of the dynamics that most defines second half of life developmental processes is the process of anamnesis. It's like those amnesias begin to fall away, and we begin to have appreciation for those earlier realities. Appreciation both for their partialities and their gifts. And we might experience that first with the recognition that as we get a bit older, we start remembering earlier things in our life. But it's more profound than that. What we're really re-engaging is those underlying sensibilities. And it's those underlying sensibilities that are what it's that integrative process of those underlying sensibilities is what allows us to become not just old, but in potential wise as we become older. I mean, a lot of people don't become wiser as they get older. A lot of people becomes more rigid and stuck in their ways. But when people actually take on the developmental tasks of the second half of life, which is not something that psychology has written about that much, but certain people really have. It's a very, that's an integrative process. And in terms of your question about what's cultural maturity asking, it's an analogous kind of newly conscious integrative process that can allow the kind of, we could say, more systemic understanding, more complete kind of understanding. We could also say more wise understanding that's needed as we go forward. And creative systems theory says that's going to be really critical. I mean, I think you can make a really good argument that if the concept of cultural maturity or something similar isn't correct, it's really hard to be legitimately optimistic about our human future.
Yeah. And there's no reason to think it wouldn't continue, because the growth is well established. We can see that we've grown. We can see in the individual that you're born and you're growing from a toddler to a child to a teenager to a young adult, and that is, it seems to me, built into the cosmos, that growth thing.
Yes. But you just said a profound and radically controversial thing.
Okay.
You don't realize you have. I mean, to me, it's obvious.
Yeah.
To you, it's obvious.
Okay? Oh, yes.
Okay, but the two critical recognitions with the concept of cultural maturity, one is that without it, without it or something like it, we really can't deal with the important challenges ahead for us as a species. It's, and we could go in detail about why every one of the major challenges ahead requires it, okay?
Yeah.
But the other thing is that because it's a developmental notion, the potential for it, at least the potential, is developmentally built into who we are, okay? If we had to invent it from whole cloth, I would say we're doomed. We're just not
can't.
But it's useful to recognize that evolutionary ideas are not only fairly rare, they're taboo within academia for the most part.
I know.
And I would say for a simple reason, actually, that's a quite understandable reason. And that is that academia has its roots in modern age thought, and its bottom line is rational material understanding, okay? And so, for example, simple notions like intelligence has multiple aspects, like I put forward before, which seems, as a creative person, it's pretty obvious, or that culture evolves, are not acceptable.
They're and you're right. They're taboo.
That's right, with rare exception. So
Yeah.
I'm very much aware of that when I speak in academic contexts. It's like there's a certain within a significant portion of academia, there's a real acceptance of postmodern thought, which in a certain way involves a critique of rationality.
Yes.
Okay, but it doesn't allow us to move beyond simply that critique.
Right. So
in the process, we end up with our current really quite crazy situation in which within a postmodern world, it's sort of everybody gets their own truth, and it's different strokes for different folks. And you end up in that critical crisis of purpose we're in right now because there's no guidance. It's like we're just adrift, and people feel that. So academia is stuck in a place where it can provide much less guidance for young people than it really needs to. It's not being the trusted agent that we would like it to be right now. In part because it's just out of its history of how it's framed the nature of intelligence and the nature of truth. It has a particularly hard time with that next step that requires us to hold our experience in more complete ways. Yeah. That's changing to some degree. I mean, there's all kinds of topics that used to be totally taboo that are increasingly okay to talk about. And,
Can you think of a couple?
Creativity is one. Religion, spirituality, you can talk about more. You can talk more about gender. I remember part of what sort of got me started in the development of creative systems theory. We talked before. I was originally a sculptor and a musician and fascinated with creative process. And I assumed that when I went to college that I was actually planning to have put together my own minor in creative process, and because I assumed academia had written all kinds of things about creative process, and I wanted to learn everything that it's. And I went around and talked to the people I most respected at the university, and they said, academia has almost nothing to say about creativity. So you're kind of on your own. Yeah. Don't waste your time putting together.
Yeah. Well, and the idea of growth
but notice that you can't understand creative process without understanding developmental dynamics, without understanding multiple intelligences, without being able to step into a reality that has more uncertainty, more complexity, more nuance, more contingencies of relativities than is a territory we're used to being in. So for me, then it was like, okay, so I'm going to have to figure out how to map some of that. And if we're going to map it, we need totally different mapping tools, because the rational mechanistic mapping tools we have don't work. The religious spiritual mapping tools we've had are not sufficient. Neither is sufficient. As a matter of fact, I'm going to have to be able to find ways to think that are encompassing enough that I can hold the scientific and the spiritual simultaneously without conflict, which creative systems theory very comfortably does.
Yeah.
And,
well, that's the, I think of it as you were talking about how as we bring on maturity in our individual being, you used a word that I think is something like the opposite of amnesia, where
anamnesia.
Amnesia. Okay.
Anamnesia, yeah.
Yeah, where you begin to remember and bring back and re-inhabit, in a way, right? These earlier stages and ways of seeing the world. And is that right so far?
Yeah, it is. I mean, and it's not in any sense of going back. It's just that you
it's a bringing forward
in the aspects of intelligence that are able to appreciate those earlier times. Yeah.
So then as a culture, as we mature, we're doing some cultural version of that same thing.
Right. That's exactly right.
Exactly. And so let's then turn a little bit and focus on the political polarization, which I know you have really thought deeply about. And how would you look at that with this developmental view of amnesia?
Anamnesia.
Anamnesia. Okay. Yeah, got it.
Well, I wrote the Discord book, Perspective and Guidance for Time-Based Discord, just out of, I just found myself deeply concerned during the year that, it's like every issue is becoming polarized so rapidly. I mean, when the pandemic started, I had several colleagues contact me and said, okay, we've got a virus. It's just a virus. I'm sure we're going to polarize around it. How in the world? I can't even imagine how we polarize about it, and so I said, all I said is, well, I know we'll do it eventually and quicker than you might imagine, but would I ever have been able to predict that we do it around masks? Essentially, we are polarizing around everything.
Yeah.
And much of the point with the book is it's not an issue, it has to do not with what we think, but how we think. Okay, such that any perception by the nature of how we're thinking, we're coming at situations from different kinds of cognitive organization, and because of that, they immediately polarize. Okay, and that's a real problem. It's a huge problem. I mean, obviously at the level of just neighbors not getting along with neighbors, but it's not consistent with the it's not of the survival of democratic representative government. I mean, we basically have government that's not able to, that's in gridlock, that can't make any decisions because of the degree of polarization. And I would say of ultimately even greater significance than that is that we're left unable to effectively deal with and grasp any of the critical questions ahead for us as a species, because those questions require culturally mature perspective. And when we're polarized, we're not capable of culturally mature perspective. When we're polarized, ideology, a simple definition within the image for ideology is it's what we get when we identify with a single crayon in the box, instead of being able to hold the whole box.
Yeah.
And right now we're having opposing crayons. And the task isn't, you might think that the task is to better get along or compromise or meet the other person halfway, but actually the task is bigger than that, which is part of what makes it fascinating and challenging and much of what the book is about. Because, to use the box of crayons image, to compromise or to meet halfway is like two crayons talking to each other. Okay. that you just end up with Muddy Brown with that. That doesn't get you there. Okay?
Yeah.
It's the ability to hold the whole box that makes the difference. And if we put it in developmental terms, okay, I would say that wasn't the case 50 years ago. It's like for the entirety of the modern age, okay, the generation of a particular kind of polarity, okay, and people splitting in it, and then debating and finding compromise, that's the ability to do that is what's allowed democratic governance to exist, okay? So like creative systems theory can map out how every stage in the evolution of culture is organized in terms of a different kind of polar relationship, okay? And there's a specific kind of polar relationship that define modern age thought. And you end up with like objective and subjective, or mind and body, as reflections of that, or within the political sphere, left and right, as we commonly think about it, okay? But in order to bring culturally mature perspective to questions, that no longer holds up. So at the beginning of the book, I just put forward sort of an architecture for the book. I said, with any issue we look at, we'll come at the similar way. It's like in the old story, when an issue became polarized, the task was to figure out which pole was right, and then either fight for it, maybe to the death, or at least to find compromise with the other half, okay? Yep. Once you move into culture mature territory, the task and the perception is very, very different. You assume that what you're hearing is left and right hands of a larger polar relationship that has not been perceived before, and which we have not been capable of perceiving before. You can also assume that the really hard, important question that needs to be looked at has not yet been identified by either the left or the right, and that you need to start by being willing to look head on, directly confront that larger question that has to be articulated and understood systemically in order even to be grasped as a question.
Halt. That is great. And I want to actually underline it, because what I'm always trying to do here with the Daily Evolver and with Post-Progressive Insights and all of it, what we're doing here is, what's it look like? What's this next stage look like? What does cultural maturity look like? What we would say, what does integral consciousness look like? Yeah. And I love what you said, and I want to underline it. One is, and this is something I'm seeing arising in the intelligentsia and in the culture at large to some degree, and it's still small, but I'm seeing it grow. And that is, when you hear anything, you realize that that's one perspective, that if we simplify polarization into the left and right, you're not satisfied until you've deeply drank from both the perspectives of the left and the right, right? Yeah. I mean, and you have to identify what news you're getting and where it's coming from. And there's an impulse and an imperative to fill out the field and to know what you're doing. And as you just said, that's new.
Yes, that is new. And there's an additional step. Okay.
And that's identifying the problem that neither of them can identify in the confines of their own worldviews.
That's right. So
yeah.
For example, so the best of thinkers who are able to say, there's something to learn from both sides, okay? Very, very rarely do you get the next recognition, which is we can't then add the best of each side together and get where we need to go.
Yeah, right. And put them in a blender.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Right. I love what you say about the crayons. I remember as a kid, I would put the yellow and the green and the red, and it was pretty for a while. There's a big brown blob.
Exactly. And that's something that, that requires integrated meta perspective to grasp. Okay, it becomes obvious from there, but creative systems theory has some very specific terms for that. It calls it a compromise fallacy.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm blessed. I feel blessed whenever I hear somebody simply not taking sides, simply being able to acknowledge that there must be a little bit of truth from both sides, but to get beyond the compromise fallacy and to say, okay, what's the larger question that not only is critical and important for us to look at, but in fact, possibly we couldn't have tolerated prior to now.
Exactly.
You know, it's not like anything's broken. It's like we're being challenged to a next chapter that's a hugely important chapter, which has huge rewards potentially, okay? I'm not certain we're gonna get there. It demands so much of it. Like, you know, the potential is there developmentally, but possibility is not destiny. And we're at a time right now where, you know, where we're regressing. Over the last 20 years, we've gone backwards significantly around culture mature capacities. And I mean, the level of polarization we're seeing now, we have not seen before.
Yeah. Well,
in a similar way, and it's globally, it's not just political polarization here. It's, you know, it's seeing authoritarian regimes replacing fledgling democracies around the planet. And so we're in an awkward in between place, and creative systems theory has a phrase for some of that too. And a lot of what we're experiencing right now, it talks in terms of transitional absurdity. It's like systems get overwhelmed beyond what they can handle. When they get beyond what they can handle, they polarize, and then we regress. And, you know, hopefully that's a 2-step forward, 1 step back thing. But you know,
I interpret it a little differently. I do see absolutely the polarization is greater. I'm not sure that's not a function of the development itself, where the perspectives or the worldviews have to be completely laid out on the field. And the whole field has to be populated with the nuts and the extremists and this one and that one. And then when we get the whole thing, we have more that we can work with to integrate into the next stage. And so that's a little bit of a positive spin on it. But, you know, I'm good with regression. Most people,
I would say, you know, it's a great conversation. I mean, I start out the perspective and guidance book by saying one of the most important questions is, why are we seeing the degree of political and social polarization we are? And I also say I don't have a complete answer for it.
Yeah. I think it's the brown blob wants to, you know, become differentiated so that we can see all the crazy colors.
Right.
Maybe.
Well, maybe. And I think there's multiple ways of thinking about it. I mean, a simple way is just the 2-step forward, 1 step back nature of change. And
totally.
And so it's no big deal.
Yeah.
I think another, you know, I'm quite confident that a major portion of it is the degree to which we're facing challenges on the planet that are really just overwhelming us, you know, from globalization to certain technological kinds of things. And quite honestly, one of the major things is some of the things that come with culture mature change, driving some of that, pushing the system beyond what it can handle. You know, we're losing some of the handholds that we've traditionally had to define ourselves and define truth and define the relationships, and that's pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I would agree with, framed somewhat differently. You know, creative systems theory would predict that we'd be having a hard time right now.
Yeah.
Okay. For somewhat different reasons, but mostly because of that overwhelm that is inherently there. So the interesting question becomes, for me, at the terms of how to understand the cause of what we're seeing right now, is if cultural maturity related changes are a major portion of the driver of what's pushing us beyond what we can handle, then interestingly, what's causing the discomfort has the cure built into it.
Oh, cool.
So in a sense, one pushes So you end up with a pretty different, similar place to what you got to with a somewhat different explanation. But so it's like, okay, can we have the courage to move forward in the midst of all the craziness? And, if in fact, some of the ways we're playing with framing things hold up, the persistence should pay off.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look, Charles, because I know you do this, at these actual issues that we're facing. And you talk about, in fact, I think you wrote a book called Quick and Dirty Answers to the Biggest Questions of Our Time. War and peace, climate, healthcare, immigration, abortion, race, science and faith. Progress itself is, that progress is taboo, in most academic circles. How would you pick one of those, like immigration or
you pick one. You pick one.
Well, let's do the one that's most in the news these days and most up in the culture, I think, and that is race.
Okay. That may be
immigration fits into that, of course, but
okay. Well, let's do immigration first, and then let's move to race, just because there's ways in which immigration is a bit easier.
Okay.
But one of the things is that in terms of, you along with a few other ones like healthcare and abortion, you sort of touched on the topics that are the chapters in the Discord book, and one of the interesting things with each of the topics is that sort of each one's interesting in and of itself, but each one has a particular lesson to teach, okay, in terms of the challenge of culturally mature perspective. So let me do the immigration one first, just because it has a kind of easy lesson, and that is cultural maturity requires one to be very aware of the contextual relativity of truth. And most of our ideas about truth are absolutist truths of one sort or another, okay? So immigration, I start the immigration chapter with a fascinating conversation I had with one of my, with a close colleague who lives in London. And we were talking about immigration. I'd not given the question a great deal of attention, but he was in the middle of Brexit and was getting real major critique from his colleagues because he was a pro-Brexit guy, and he said part of it is just because it just feels like we're being overwhelmed by immigrants, and a lot of them really don't have any respect for the history of the city that they're in, and that's a lot of it. I don't. And he's a psychiatrist and a good guy, and he said, "Hey, that's not real. I'm not real happy with that, And I come from Washington State, where immigration has been almost entirely a positive force. We wouldn't have an Apple industry, we wouldn't have a high-tech industry. It's totally. So it's like, oh, that's interesting. In those different contexts, the question becomes different. And so what I saw was that really the question of immigration is not, notice if you think about it, the question of, the fundamental polarity in any creative system. And we tend to think of polarities as between one position and another. The fundamental polarity in any creative systems is in fact between unity on one side and difference on the other. Okay, so notice with immigration, what do you get? You get difference, build that wall, okay? Or you get a sort of woke liberal populism on the other side that if you look beneath the surface is really saying we shouldn't have boundaries at all. And I say, they're both nuts, okay? And it's like, and what's a better fate? What's a better image for thinking about immigration? And so my undergraduate training is as a biologist, and there's semi-permeable membranes. Well, guess what? Cells are alive because you get the exact right time and place balance between permeabilities of a semi-permeable membrane. If you want to make life-affirming choices for a cell, you look at the membrane. In this case, a national boundary. okay, and you simply ask, okay, what are the kinds of permeability we want to be supporting, and the kinds of impermeability we want to be supporting.
Right.
Now notice, that doesn't end the discussion, but it's no longer a polarized discussion. It's not like one's good and the other's bad. It's like, oh, permeability and impermeability are both critical to life. They're both part of what's life affirming.
Yeah.
We just have to sit down around the table with the whole complexity of people involved,
Yeah.
and do our best, take our best shot at defining permeability.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's the larger question that once you ask it, the permeability image, once you ask it, takes us beyond polarization and has us engaging the right question.
Yeah.
So there's one. You know, we're very much in the midst of the race, gender, bigotry, identity politics conversation. And I think it's wonderfully rich and complex, and more so than most people are even beginning to get a handle on. Okay. And I say this out of the context of somebody who is, I mean, I have through my whole life been involved in those kinds of, questions, from consulting in South Africa and with Nelson Mandela on changes at that time, to earlier in my life, helping start a free clinic for Native Americans in Seattle, and supporting those, and certainly supporting women's rights through my life with the Institute and everything. But it's also the case that I think we're in a time where a lot of the discussion's a bit nutty. And sort of woke left populist sort of things around, and we could take a lot of time talking this, but in relation to questions around both gender and race are often hugely simplistic in ways that are not, terribly helpful. Mm-hmm. With questions that are not that complicated. I mean, like our notions, let's defund the police. And my response is, well, I think we need to revisit police. I've been talking about that for 40 years. And there's, and that includes, it just, at the simplest level, we're giving the police all kinds of responsibilities and obligations that they don't want to have. I mean, they don't want to be dealing with homelessness, with mental health, those kinds of issues. They never asked for that and got thrown onto their plate. And the kind of personality style of person who is likely to be a policeman and will be the best police person, in fact, is one of the least equipped people to deal with that kind of situation. And we're sort of talking about the police as if they're the enemy now. It's sort of, and it's sort of it really comes back to being a kind of anti-authoritarian ideology that people are getting caught in. And so here's the awareness that is pivotal there, and it's beyond where people are at right now, and beyond, and it's an awareness is actually beyond what's helpful at this point. I mean, sometimes really important recognitions that are true ultimately and helpful, aren't necessarily helpful practically in a situation. So it's not an argument. This is not an argument I would pretend to make around race issues right now, for example, because I don't think it'd be helpful necessarily. But I divide the tasks when we're coming to identity politics issues into two chapters. I would say issues that have to do with equal opportunity, equal rights, equal safety are 100% goods, okay, and absolutely critical. But those questions don't have a lot to do with cultural maturity. Those are right and appropriate accomplishments for the latter substages of the modern age task, which is the task that started with the Bill of Rights.
Yep.
Okay. And it just applies everywhere, and we have to do that, okay? When you start getting into culture mature territory, then you start looking at the question of how do we hold things in an adequately complete way, okay? And that means getting beyond projections and holding the whole complexity in oneself. Well, obviously, in that context, bigotry falls 100% short, okay? Because any kind of bigotry, what you're in a sense doing is allowing yourself to feel superior by projecting a denigrated part onto other people, okay? That's how it works. But it's also the case that what we're seeing right now in woke identity politics stuff to a significant degree is really a victim narrative and sort of competing victim narratives. Who can feel like the biggest victim? Now, there's an important distinction between accurately identifying victimization and a victim narrative, okay? And it is accurate that Native Americans were victimized in the move west. It is accurate that slavery is victimization. But when you hold a that sort of angry victim narrative as a way of self-identification, that stops just as short of culturally mature thought, because it's similarly as a projection. You know, as you are projecting authority, you're anti-authoritarian in the sense of projecting authority onto other people. The irony in that is that you're giving your authority away. So in the act of feeling empowered by feeling like the victim, in fact, you're undermining your own ability to have authority fully in your own life. It actually gets in the way of solving problems that we need to solve. So I include in the book, it's a quote by Toni Morrison, which I love, which is essentially, she says, you know, I make every effort to write without the white man's gaze. You know, think about that. See, it's sort of like right now with identity politics, our gaze is on the perceived oppressor, and everything is going to be okay if the oppressor changes their behavior.
Yeah.
I'd say often there's a piece of truth in that.
Yeah.
But I think we're at a stage in the evolution of these questions where we really need to move more in the culturally mature territory where we're not giving away the gaze and the state. So I look at a lot of what I see in sort of woke identity politics right now as sort of insights that were useful, creative, and appropriate for 50 and 60 years ago in terms of the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. But they're not sufficiently sophisticated for what can actually make meaningful change in our time. I'm assuming that most of what we're seeing in our time will in fact have ultimately positive effects.
Yeah.
It just
well, I do too. I mean, it's just not framed as large as it ultimately needs to be. That's all. Yeah. I mean, I think to me, part of what a culturally mature view would be a acceptance and even friendliness to the fight itself that is going on, because there is, in some ways, that's how we move forward. It's certainly how evolution moves forward in nature, is through, struggle. It also moves forward through friending, and, I always love the term homo puppy, that human beings are like puppies. We're just so damn friendly that is also a big part of the evolutionary force. But so is struggle. And that gets us, it's like for me, the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, both of them have raised my consciousness. And I thought I had a pretty darn highly raised consciousness. But what has happened through these, and yes, I agree that if you believe them absolutistically, then that's not cultural maturity. But to drink deeply of these various ideologies has me just seeing people more as people, and I always think of the windshield wiper that is just wiping away my conditioned thoughts when I see a woman or a person of another race, and that so that I can actually see them and see into them. And that's part of it in terms of my interior and my own maturity. And then I think in terms of the culture that we do, it's almost like you were talking about the ultimate polarity being same and difference, is that there's a story of America that is a triumphal story, you know, and that's the one I guarantee you learned it in school just the same as I did. And manifest destiny was a good thing, from sea to shining sea. And that is a beautiful story. America has a beautiful story.
It is.
But the new story is of the other side of it. You know, the 1619 story, the story of oppression, and, you know, who was, who got the short end of the stick in various situations, you know.
Of course.
Both of those have to be true, because they are.
Right. And I'm saying something else with that. I mean, I totally agree with all that. Okay. I think the observation that we're seeing some regression right now, and some significant regression, is important. Okay. And I think it's really dangerous. So I'm not okay with just assuming that regression is fine and just part of, you know, how things change in a wonderful world. I think it is significant, and you know, and you know, as I was talking, you know, I would differ with you a little bit, but only out of our personal experience in a certain way, in terms of, you know, I don't feel that I've personally learned much from the Me Too movement or from Black Lives Matter. Those were conversations we were having 40 years ago at the Institute. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying they aren't valuable and that a lot of people can learn from them. But I think we need to be having some different kinds of conversations in both spheres to really get to where we need to go. Around the Me Too movement kind of stuff, you know, one of my books is specifically on issues of gender and sexuality and such as that. And so mm-hmm. I try to paint a larger picture in terms of how do we think about notions of gender and what it means for people to relate to each other. But it's also the case that those are, if it's either of those, you know, is that we're talking about kinds of perceptions that are, you know, that are out 20, 30, maybe 50 years sometimes, about where most people are comfortable with holding questions. So I'm not saying this is how people should look at things. What I'm suggesting is that eventually these issues need to be held more systemically if we're going to make really meaningful progress going forward. So I'm trying to do my best to map what that looks like. Mm-hmm.
And maybe tell us a little bit more of, fill in that map a bit, if you would.
Yeah, but I do, you know, so in that sort of the question, so that there's a dual question of, you know, if we are regressing a bit, how do we make sense of that? And like I said, maybe it doesn't matter at all. I mean, maybe it's just a little 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Maybe it's just part of the messiness of change. Okay. You know, maybe it's a little bit of how we're being overwhelmed, but it's a matter of just moving through it. But clearly I was concerned enough about it to write a whole book about it.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of the issue of discord in our time. And one of the interesting, so I'm going to your second question, so what does that look like more long term? And, you know, you can ask in terms of specific questions, but one of the interesting realities, insights about the concept of cultural maturity and integrated meta perspective, just the ability to see more systemically about things, is, and it's one that's, I'm fascinated when that are sort of obvious, and I actually said 20 years ago, and I'm only now sort of finally figuring them out, what they really mean, you know. But it's one of the ones that I found most provocative to myself lately, is that it's not just that more mature perspective and more systemic understanding defines the task of our time right now and how we need to think. It's not just that there's some real dangers if we can't pull it off and sooner rather than later. It's also the case that the basic reorientation in terms of stages of culture that we're talking about with integrative meta perspective is really the basic kind of rethinking of thought we need going forward way into the future. We could arguably say for the whole of the future of humanity. I mean, plenty of things will change. We'll have new inventions of all sorts. But the question becomes, how do we bring the necessary wisdom to managing those new inventions? And that's a question of how we hold reality. It's also the case that certainly our ability to think in more complete ways will refine, will bring nuance and refinement and detail to that over time, such that we can be wise in much more subtle ways if we move forward 100 years from now. But the basic cognitive difference, the basic difference in terms of how we're needing to hold things that we're being challenged to right now is really, we're really talking about the whole rest of the story in a certain way. It's like it's sort of like we were making the analogy to to midlife and individual development, the two halves of individual development. It's like you really can think of individual development in terms of two halves. There's certain kinds of developmental stories that make up the first half of life, and then there's the second half of life, and it also has its chapters, but there's a fundamental shift that defines the difference between first half of life and second half of life developmental stories. And so I think a way of thinking about the task of our time is we're trying to figure out how to do that second half story. Mm-hmm. Which is the second half story, which allows us to be wise and sustainable and nuanced in our choices, that is fully able to tolerate and find meaning in the complexities of our differences and the nuances and the complexities of the questions that we're confronting.
Hallelujah. I like that, the finding meaning in the complexities of our differences. That's good. How do you think we're doing, Charles? I mean, you see anything that's hopeful? Any cool people or public intellectuals or?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, one thing I often say is that I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. The pieces that I think are important is that in terms of what my contribution has been with the Institute as such is to me, there's clearly a way forward, okay? And it's a way forward that potentially is built into who we are. And that multiple steps in terms of that have been made throughout the last century. We can go through, I mean, from the thinking in the early decades of the last century were important contributions to culture mature thought, as I see things. And right now we're at an odd time, like, and an awkward in-between time in a lot of ways. I think in a lot of fields we've gone backwards in the last 20 years. But there's other fields in which we've made important progress in the last 20 years as well, which is sort of interesting to watch that happening simultaneously. Mm-hmm. We talk, I think it's interesting. I mean, people will often ask me, what percentage of the population do you see capable of some significant degree of culture mature thought at this point? And I think my answer is a little bit can seem backwards because we tend to look to identified leaders and thought leaders and political leaders when we ask that kind of question. And I would say for the most part, political leaders and thought leaders can be in those positions because they have a pretty large mass of followers. And there is not a mass of followers, of culturally mature followers. So the result is that we also don't get culturally mature leaders to a significant degree. So it's the wrong place to look. Okay. So I would say within average populations of people, the percentage is higher than you might imagine.
What, 5, 10?
I say between 5 and 10%. Within average population. There are wonderful exceptions in terms of leaders who have really been ahead of their time. I mentioned Nelson Mandela. I think Barack Obama is that way in terms of political leaders who both I identified early on that they were bringing culturally mature capacities, and I was incredibly impressed during their times of leadership in terms of the degree they actually
me too.
That. And there's a few people in the media. I think David Brooks often succeeds. Tom Friedman often succeeds. I don't think they have a conceptual framework to understand kind of why they're reaching some of the conclusions they're reaching. But on the other hand, I will, one of the litmus tests for me is simply that I read their work. I mean, it's
interesting enough.
I think it's possible that something that might surprise me will show up. The great majority of commentators, and unfortunately right now, it's the case not just with media on the right, which is totally predictable, but media on the left from NPR to the New York Times is just as predictable.
Right.
On the left, I will frequently go, how in the hell did that get published? I mean, not only not the conclusion, but how did it even get considered? So I think there's I think there's a good percentage in the general population, and I think our current U.S. president's not doing a bad job. I don't think he's doing it particularly from a culturally mature place, but I think he's doing it from a good centrist, solid leadership place, and we should be very grateful for that.
It's nice change from
that's a nice
thing before.
That's from what's been before, exactly. Yeah. I don't know. Does that fit?
That sounds.
That about how you see things? Too?
Yeah, in terms of public figures and major public figures, Barack Obama is the gold standard to me of somebody who's operating what I would call integral consciousness, and just has a flexibility of mind and the ability to put himself. In fact, I'm reading his book. He's constantly putting himself through the eyes of other people, the people he's dealing with. That's a very conscious process that he is doing. And it's just magnificent to think that he was elected the president of the United States twice.
That's right.
And
I don't think he was. I mean, he was twice, and I mean, clearly he wasn't appreciated from the right, but I don't think he was adequately appreciated from the left. I don't think those folks on the left understood what they had.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of the occupational hazard of cultural maturity, is both sides are going to, think that you're a traitor.
Oh, dear. Have you had that experience?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, my liberal friends think I'm a reactionary, and my conservative friends think that I'm a snowflake. And I don't know. I'm good with that. I mean, my goal, just sort of a little back pocket goal, is to make their case better than they do. And, in many cases, I think I do. But that's in that itself, I mean, just being friendly and inhabiting these different worldviews it's just so interesting that at some point you just want to do it. Yeah. And there's some fruit that is born out of that.
Yes. Profound fruit.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Charles. Well, anything else you want to put on the table? It's so fascinating to talk to you.
Just only that, keep up the good work, because, I don't think there's anything more important right now than, than voices that can do just what you were just articulating. And, whether we look at it as being in a pretty troubled place right now, or whether we look at it in terms of emerging possibilities, that's where the conversation has to be.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And so great to talk.
Yeah.
Look forward to more.
Yeah, likewise. And best to you on these books. Again, I'll put them up. Creative Systems Theory. This is the magnum opus.
Yes.
A comprehensive theory of purpose, change, and interrelationship in human systems. And then the shorter book, topic of political polarization, is called Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord: Why We See Such Extreme Social and Political Polarization and What We Can Do About It. And I can't think of more of a bullseye than those two books. So thank you so much, Charles M. Johnson, MD. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Charles.
Take
See you
care.
next time.
Hey.